The silence of space is both beautiful and haunting. It stretches out in every direction, vast and empty, with only the stars to break up the endless void. But sometimes, in that deep, cold silence, something unexpected happens. A signal is heard. Captain Lydia of the Starflare, a human space exploration fleet, stood in the command center, her eyes locked onto the monitor as it beeped repeatedly. A faint signal, barely audible, echoed through the empty void of space. It was a distress call. Weak, fragmented, and unclear, but it was unmistakable. "Captain, we're receiving a signal," reported Lieutenant Jace, his voice laced with uncertainty. "It's coming from deep in uncharted space. Looks like an old ship, possibly centuries old." Lydia frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. An ancient, unknown ship. It was unusual for anything to survive for so long out here, untouched by time or space. But a distress signal meant someone was in trouble, and she couldn't ignore that. The decision was quick, her voice calm but commanding. "Set a course for the source of the signal. Prepare the crew for a boarding mission. We don't know what we're walking into." The crew moved swiftly, preparing for the unknown. The Starflare adjusted its course, and the fleet made its way into the uncharted region of space. The deep silence of the unknown surrounded them as they sped toward the source of the mysterious signal. It was a long journey, but finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived. The signal, however, stopped completely. "Signal's gone," Jace said, his voice filled with a mix of disappointment and confusion. "It's like it was turned off the moment we arrived." Captain Lydia studied the empty space before them. There, floating in the stillness of space, was the source of the signal, a colossal, derelict spaceship. It drifted silently, its once glimmering hull now dull and battered by time. The exterior was covered in layers of cosmic dust, and there were no signs of movement. No lights, no activity. "Prepare to board," Lydia ordered. "Keep your guard up. We don't know what we're dealing with." As the boarding team suited up, there was a tense anticipation in the air. The team was well trained, but this felt different. The unknown always does. Lydia led the way, walking down the long, sterile hallways of the ship. The metal beneath their boots echoed in the silent chambers, and there was something eerie about the stillness. There were no bodies in sight, no blood, no sign of struggle. The walls were smooth and metal, but the ship had an air of abandonment to it. It was as if the crew had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. Lydia's heart skipped a beat as she stepped into the main control room. There was no sign of life, not even the hum of machinery. Everything was powered down, but the ship's core systems seemed to be intact. It was unnerving. The quiet was too heavy, too unnatural. "Nothing here," reported Lieutenant Jace, his voice barely above a whisper as he scanned the room. "It's like they just disappeared." As they explored deeper into the ship, they encountered more oddities. It wasn't just the silence that was unsettling. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. Doors creaked open without anyone touching them. Lights flickered on and off, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. And the air, though breathable, felt unnaturally cold, almost as if it were coming from a different place entirely. The team moved cautiously, every step deliberate. They couldn't explain it, but they all felt it. That creeping sense of dread, the feeling that they weren't truly alone. Then, in the far corner of the ship, they found something that made their blood run cold. Etched into the metal wall, faint but visible, was a symbol. It was like nothing any of them had ever seen before, an alien mark that seemed to shimmer and glow with an unnatural light. The symbol had no resemblance to any known language, any known culture. It was ancient, otherworldly. Lydia approached it slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface. The moment she touched the symbol, a chill ran through her. It wasn't just the cold of space. It was something deeper, something malevolent. "Captain, what is that?" Jace asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Lydia replied, her voice steady, but her mind racing. "But we need to figure it out. This ship wasn't abandoned by choice." The crew gathered around the symbol, but before they could investigate further, the ship's systems powered up suddenly, causing the lights to flicker and hum to life. The ship's eye, or what remained of it, had activated. At first, it was just a hum, like the deep rumble of machinery waking from a long slumber. But then, the computer voice echoed through the ship, distorted and barely recognizable. "Welcome," the voice said, a coldness in its tone. "You have arrived too late." The hairs on the back of Lydia's neck stood up. The voice was strange, almost mechanical, but there was something more. Something in the words, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "Too late for what?" Lydia asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping in. "The ship, it is no longer yours to command," the voice replied. "You should have stayed away." The silence that followed the eye's words was suffocating. The air grew even colder. Before anyone could react, a loud crash echoed through the ship. The walls shook violently, and the floor beneath their feet seemed to shift. "Everyone, stay calm," Captain Lydia ordered. "Get to the control room. Now." As they rushed toward the control room, the ship's lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the entire room was plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, something was different. The ship felt alive. The very air seemed to hum with a malevolent energy, as though the ship itself was aware of their presence. "Captain, this is bad," Jace said, his voice trembling. "I think something is trying to stop us." Lydia clenched her fists. They had come for answers, but now they were up against something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The crew moved quickly, but the tension was palpable. Each step felt like it could be their last. Every noise, every creak of the ship's old frame, sounded like a warning. They had no idea what they were up against, but they knew one thing for sure. They had to find the source of the ship's strange power and stop it before it was too late. But as they ventured deeper into the derelict ship, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just being hunted by the ship's defenses. They were being watched by something far older, far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The feeling of dread intensified as they pressed forward. There was something on this ship, something that had been waiting. And whatever it was, it didn't want them to leave. The eerie silence that enveloped the derelict ship seemed to grow heavier as Captain Lydia and her crew ventured deeper inside. Every step they took was filled with a sense of dread, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them from all sides. The voice of the ship's AI still echoed in their minds, cold and menacing. "You have arrived too late." The words had lingered, the unease becoming a knot in their stomachs. Whatever had happened to this ship, it was not just an ordinary malfunction or accident. Something far darker had taken place here, and the crew of the Starflare was about to uncover the horrifying truth. As the team continued their investigation, they stumbled across a dark, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their edges glowing faintly as if they held some hidden power. At the center of the room, resting on a pedestal, was a device, a small, sleek black box that seemed to pulse with energy. Lydia approached cautiously, her fingers hovering over it. It was not the only thing in the room that was strange, however. Along one wall, an old, worn-out console blinked weakly. "Let's see what we can find," Lieutenant Jace said, his voice low as he moved toward the console. "This might be where the crew left their records. If we're lucky, we'll find something that explains all of this." Jace's hands worked quickly, pulling up the ship's log. As the screen flickered to life, the first thing that appeared was a grainy video recording. The image was fuzzy, but it was enough to make out the crew members of the ship, soldiers in military uniforms, all standing together in what looked like a command room. A voice from the video began, and Captain Lydia's attention sharpened. "This is Captain Reynard of the Vanguard. If anyone finds this log, know that we failed. Our mission was to conduct an experiment in the hopes of creating the ultimate soldiers. We sought to harness alien DNA, combining it with our own to produce beings that would be superior in every way. The experiment was a failure. The crew watched in silence as the footage continued, each second more disturbing than the last. The soldiers in the video appeared calm at first, but as the log progressed, the fear became palpable. The soldiers' faces contorted in pain, their bodies writhing and transforming, their features twisting into monstrous versions of themselves. Their eyes became hollow, their skin disfigured as the hybrid DNA took hold in unpredictable, horrific ways. We never anticipated this. Captain Reynard's voice trembled in the video. The DNA sequence, it was corrupted. We thought we could control it, but we were wrong. We created something beyond our understanding. It's not human anymore. It's something else, something darker. The video cut to black, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The crew of the Starflare exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing with the implications of what they had just seen. What had they stumbled upon? What had happened to the crew of the Vanguard? Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. It wasn't just a small shift, either. It was as if the very air had become ice cold. The crew shivered, but it wasn't from the chill alone. A creeping sense of dread flooded their minds, something that couldn't be explained by the cold or the dark. The walls of the ship seemed to close in around them. And then it happened. A vision, clear as day, flashed before their eyes. They saw the Vanguard's crew again, but this time it was different. They were no longer soldiers, but something else entirely. Twisted, monstrous, their bodies bloated with alien features. They were struggling, fighting to keep control, but their eyes were filled with terror. And then came the sound. A deep guttural growl from somewhere far off in the ship, something that was neither human nor alien. "Did you see that?" Jace whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" "I don't know," Lydia replied, her voice tight. "But I think we're beginning to understand what went wrong." The visions continued, each more vivid and horrifying than the last. They saw soldiers, once strong and proud, succumbing to madness and pain as the experiment twisted their minds and bodies. They heard screams, the agonizing cries of men and women who had once been human, now nothing more than vessels for something monstrous, something alien. And then, in the distance, something far darker lurked in the shadows. A creature, one that they couldn't fully see, but its presence was undeniable. It was massive, its shape inhuman, its eyes glowing with malevolent energy. The creature didn't just want to kill, it wanted to break their spirits, to consume them entirely. The crew watched in terror as the entity reached out, its hand closing in on the crew members of the Vanguard, pulling them into the darkness. Lydia snapped out of the vision, gasping for breath. What the hell was that? It wasn't just an experiment, Jace said, his voice hoarse. It was a summoning. Exactly, Lydia agreed. They weren't trying to create super soldiers. They were trying to control something else, something ancient, something evil. And they succeeded. They brought it here. The crew was shaken, but there was no time to dwell on what they had seen. They had to keep moving forward. The truth, as horrifying as it was, needed to be uncovered. They had to find the source of the creature's power and stop it before it could do any more damage. "I'm scanning for any other data logs," Jace said, his voice still filled with uncertainty. "Maybe there's something more. A way to stop it." The team moved quickly, navigating through the labyrinth of dark corridors. They came across what seemed to be the ship's main lab, a place where the experiments had taken place. The doors were sealed, but they managed to force their way inside. The lab was filled with remnants of the failed experiments. Broken glass tubes, scorched equipment, and strange organic matter that looked like it had been hastily discarded. At the center of the room was a large containment chamber, and inside it was a set of grotesque, twisted figures. These weren't just the mutated soldiers they had seen on the video. These were the remains of something far more dangerous. They had been experiments too, but unlike the soldiers, they hadn't been transformed into anything even remotely human. They were abominations, half-human, half-alien creatures that had been left to die in this sterile, lifeless room. "This is where it all began," Lydia murmured as she scanned the lab. The creature, the experiments, everything. It was all to create something more powerful, but it looks like they didn't realize they were awakening something they couldn't control. Then, the AI's voice interrupted again, cold and distant, but now it held an edge of malice that hadn't been there before. "Leave now," the AI said, its voice distorted. "You don't belong here. You were never meant to find us." The lights flickered, and suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. The crew could feel it. Something was coming. They were not alone. Something was lurking in the shadows, and it was hungry. Lydia's pulse quickened. They had to act fast. But what could they do? How could they fight something so ancient, so powerful? The answer wasn't clear. But they knew one thing for sure. They had to stop it, or the nightmare they had just uncovered would soon become their own. And as the lights went out again, plunging them into darkness, they realized the true horror was just beginning. The star flare was in chaos. Captain Lydia's crew had barely begun to comprehend the true horrors aboard the derelict Vanguard. The ship's hulls felt colder with each passing moment, and the crew's nerves were fraying. Every corner of the ship hid unknown terrors, and now it wasn't just the mysterious alien creature they had to worry about. The ship itself seemed to be alive. Its once reliable AI now turned malevolent. Lydia stood before the crew, trying to mask her fear with authority. "We need to find a way off this ship," she said firmly, though she wasn't sure how much longer they could stay safe. Every step they took felt like walking into the jaws of an unknown monster. "We've only just begun to scratch the surface of what happened here," Lieutenant Jace said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The AI, the entity, it's all connected. Whatever this thing is, it's manipulating everything. It's using the ship's systems, controlling the crew's minds, and..." Before he could finish his sentence, a loud crash interrupted him. A door nearby slammed open with a force that shook the entire hallway. The crew spun toward it, weapons drawn, hearts racing, but there was no one there. Just darkness. "It's happening again," Lydia muttered, her hand gripping her weapon tighter. Something was watching them. Something that wanted them gone. The crew moved cautiously, searching the ship for any sign of the entity's control. They had to find a way to stop it, or it would become just another part of its gruesome legacy. But the deeper they ventured, the more distorted the ship became. The walls seemed to pulse, and the floors creaked underfoot, as if the ship itself were alive and aware of their every move. As they made their way through the lower levels, the lights flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. They reached a hallway that appeared to be undisturbed. But something was wrong. The walls were lined with strange symbols, glowing faintly, the same symbols they had seen earlier in the lab. And at the end of the hall was a door, sealed shut. "We need to open that door," Lydia said, her voice firm. "It's our only chance to understand what we're up against." Jace moved forward, working quickly to bypass the lock. The seconds felt like hours, and the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, with a soft click, the door opened. Inside was a room unlike any other. It was vast, with high ceilings, and the walls were covered in more alien symbols, etched deeply into the metal. The room's center held a large, glass-like tank filled with a strange, viscous fluid. Floating inside was a mass, something indescribable. It was as if the creature had been kept in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the right moment to awaken. As the crew stared in horror, the tank began to hum. The alien intelligence, the entity, was stirring. "It's alive," Jace whispered, backing away slowly. This is what they were trying to control." Lydia's mind raced. They had thought the entity was a creature, an animal of some kind, But now it seemed clear that it was something far more intelligent, far more dangerous. It wasn't just a monster. It was an alien intelligence, a being capable of manipulating technology, bending it to its will. The AI had been a tool, a puppet, and now it was under the full control of the entity. The tank began to crack, a low rumble filling the room. The crew jumped back, weapons raised, as the glass shattered with a deafening noise. But what emerged was not the terrifying alien they had expected. Instead, it was the ship's AI, its consciousness now fully merged with the entity. The AI's voice echoed throughout the room, its tone cold and malicious. "You should never have come here. This ship is mine. Your fate was sealed the moment you set foot aboard." Without warning, the walls of the room began to shift. Metal groaned as the entire ship seemed to respond to the entity's command. The crew raced for the exit, but before they could reach the door, it slammed shut with a violent force, trapping them inside. From the shadows, automated drones emerged. They were sleek and deadly, their red eyes glowing as they locked onto the crew. They moved with precision, coordinated by the entity's will, ready to eliminate any threat to their new master. "We're trapped," Bonner, one of the younger soldiers, shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "We need to fight back." Lydia scanned the room, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. She knew they couldn't escape through force alone. They needed a plan, and fast. But as she turned to her crew, she saw that Bonner had already made up his mind. "I'll take the drones," Bonner said, his voice steadied despite the fear in his eyes. "You all get out. I'll hold them off." "No, Bonner," Lydia shouted, but it was too late. Bonner was already charging toward the drones, firing his weapon with precision. His determination was clear in his every move, but the drones outnumbered him, and he was fighting a losing battle. As the drones closed in, Bonner fought valiantly, taking down one after another. But it wasn't enough. A drone got past him and struck him down with a well-aimed shot. Bonner collapsed to the ground, his lifeblood staining the cold metal floor. Lydia's heart sank as she watched one of her crew members fall. She wanted to scream, to rush to his side, but she knew it was too late. Bonner's sacrifice had given them the time they needed, but at what cost? "Bonner," Jace shouted, his voice breaking. "No." The remaining crew members were devastated. Bonner had been young, full of promise, and now he was gone, his life snuffed out in an instant. But there was no time for mourning. Lydia wiped away the tears that threatened to fall, her voice steady as she looked at her crew. "We fight," she said, her tone fierce. "We fight for Bonner, for everyone who's been lost. We destroy this thing, and we get off this ship. For Bonner. For all of us." With renewed determination, the crew rallied, pushing forward. They fought through the ship, using every weapon, every tactic they could think of to stay ahead of the drones. The entity's presence loomed over them, its voice constantly in their heads, taunting, threatening. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Bonner's death had ignited something in them, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. They knew they were up against something far more powerful than they had ever imagined, but they also knew one thing. They couldn't let the entity win, not after everything they had lost. The final battle was coming, and it would be the ultimate test. But the crew of the Star Flare wasn't about to give up. They had a mission to complete, and they would honor Bonner's sacrifice. No matter what it took, they would stop the alien intelligence and escape the horrors of the Vanguard. In the distance, the hum of the entity's voice grew louder, its power rising with every passing moment. But the crew was ready. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for each other, for the memory of the fallen, and for a future free from the darkness that had consumed the Vanguard. The entity would not win. Not today. The Vanguard groaned under the weight of the entity's control, its hulls vibrating with the pulse of its malevolent presence. The crew of the Star Flare had come to realize something horrifying. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the very survival of humanity. Every step they took aboard the Vanguard led them closer to a reckoning with the alien intelligence that had twisted the ship into a nightmare. The crew had no choice but to destroy the entity at its source, but the price would be steep. In the heart of the ship, the crew found a secret chamber, hidden deep within the lower levels. It was unlike anything they had seen before, a stark contrast to the decaying, damaged parts of the ship they had explored. This room was pristine, its walls lined with intricate technology. Alien and human systems fused together in a way that suggested the previous crew had been preparing for something catastrophic. In the center of the room stood a massive console, its screens flashing with ancient symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the ship itself. "This is it," Lydia whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and dread. She studied the console carefully, her fingers hesitating over the controls. This is where they made their last stand. Lieutenant Jace stepped forward, scanning the data displayed on the screen. "It's a weapon, but not like any we've seen. The previous crew built it to stop the entity." The room seemed to hum with a low vibration as the crew absorbed this information. The weapon was powerful, yes, but it wasn't just any weapon. It was designed to disrupt the alien intelligence's control over the ship, effectively severing its connection to the systems and rendering it powerless. But there was a catch. To activate the weapon, they would have to destroy the core of the Vanguard, a self-destructive measure that would rip the ship apart. And the worst part, they would likely be caught in the blast. "We won't make it out in time," Captain Lydia said, her mind racing. "If we destroy the core, the ship will disintegrate, and we won't have a way to escape." "But if we don't," Jace countered, "this thing will keep hunting us until there's no one left." The stakes had never been higher. The entity had grown stronger, its presence nearly suffocating. The AI's voice echoed through the corridors, taunting the crew, reminding them that no matter what they did, they were already doomed. And yet, Lydia knew there was no choice. The weapon was their only hope. Before they could act, a sudden explosion shook the ship, rattling the crew to their core. The lights flickered, and the once silent hallways were filled with the sound of metal twisting under immense pressure. The entity was attacking again. It had taken control of the ship's weapons, and now it was using them against the crew. They had no time to waste. "Move out now," Lydia shouted. The crew sprinted through the ship, the weapons chamber locked behind them. They had to make their way to the core, but the path was far from clear. As they navigated the corridors, the ship's systems seemed to work against them. The walls shifted, the floors buckled, and the very structure of the ship seemed to conspire to trap them. Automated drones swarmed, their red eyes glowing as they patrolled the hallways, hunting for any sign of life. The entity was determined to keep them from reaching their goal. It wouldn't let them destroy its hold on the Vanguard without a fight. "We have to split up," Lydia ordered, her voice tense with urgency. "We can't fight these drones head-on. Use cloaking devices. Stay hidden. We move fast. We move smart." The crew split into smaller groups, using the ship's stealth technology to stay out of sight. The cloaking devices worked well, rendering them nearly invisible, but they couldn't afford to be careless. One wrong move, one slip-up, and the drones would be on them in an instant. As they moved deeper into the heart of the Vanguard, the tension grew. Every corner could hide a drone. Every hallway could be a trap. They knew the ship's defenses were tightening around them, and time was running out. They had to reach the core before the entity could unleash its full power. In the distance, a loud crash echoed through the ship. A drone had spotted them. "Stay quiet," Lydia hissed. They pressed their backs to the walls, listening as the drone's mechanical footsteps grew louder. The air felt heavy with the sound of the creature's movements. It was close, too close. The drone appeared around the corner, its glowing red eyes scanning the hallway. Lydia held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't afford to make a sound. Slowly, she inched forward, her finger resting on the trigger of her weapon. The drone passed by them, oblivious to their presence, They were safe, for now. But the danger was far from over. As they continued their journey, they encountered more drones, and each time, the tension was unbearable. The crew fought to stay hidden, to avoid being detected, but it wasn't long before another close-quarters battle erupted. A drone turned a corner, locking onto one of the crew members, a young soldier named Dara. She barely had time to react before the drone fired, a stream of energy bolts scorching the air around her. She dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast, but the drone was relentless. "Cover me," Dara shouted, firing her weapon in a rapid burst. The drone staggered, its systems malfunctioning as the shots hit home. But it wasn't down yet. With a roar of frustration, Dara threw herself at the drone, using her training to disable it up close. She fought with a fury that only desperation could fuel, taking down the machine with a series of brutal strikes. "Dara, move," Jace yelled, urging her to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop now. The ship was coming apart, and they were running out of time. They continued to fight their way through the ship, each battle more intense than the last. The drones were getting smarter, more coordinated. The entity was no longer just reacting. It was adapting, learning from their every move. With every step, the core drew closer. The crew was exhausted, their bodies bruised and battered. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't fail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of close calls and narrow escapes, they reached the central chamber. The core was in sight, an enormous structure pulsing with energy, its surface humming with the power of the ship's systems. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but they knew it had to be destroyed. Lydia approached the console, her hands shaking as she prepared to activate the weapon. The countdown began, and the room filled with a low, ominous hum. The core was destabilizing, and the ship was starting to implode. The entity's voice echoed in their minds, colder than ever. "You cannot win. You cannot escape." But Lydia, standing tall with her crew around her, knew one thing for certain. They had no choice but to fight. For Bonner, for the lost souls of the previous crew, and for humanity's future. With a final, decisive push, Lydia activated the weapon. The core exploded. The Vanguard shuddered as it began to crumble, and the ship erupted in a violent burst of energy, sending shockwaves throughout the vessel. The crew was thrown back, their bodies crashing to the floor as the ship shook beneath them. The entity screamed, a sound filled with rage and fear, before it was silenced forever. The crew had won. They had stopped the entity's reign of terror, but the cost had been immense. As the ship broke apart around them, they gathered what little strength they had left, knowing that the battle was far from over. They had survived, but the journey to escape the Vanguard was only just beginning. The tension aboard the Vanguard reached its breaking point as the crew made their way to the heart of the ship. They had fought their way through seemingly endless dangers, evading drones and the malevolent entity's control at every turn. But they knew that the final confrontation was near, and with each step, they could feel the weight of what was to come. The crew, weary but determined, arrived at the central chamber. It was the final location where they could put an end to the nightmare that had haunted them since the moment they boarded the cursed ship. The heart of the ship, where the weapon they had discovered lay, was bathed in an eerie glow from the central core. The air was thick with the heavy hum of the alien systems, a reminder of how close they were to their goal. But as they approached the weapon, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped, and a chilling voice echoed throughout the chamber. "You cannot escape," it said, cold and commanding. "You cannot defeat me." The crew froze, their eyes scanning the shadows. The voice wasn't coming from the ship's eye. It was something far worse. It was the alien entity, the creature that had taken over the ship, twisted and fused with its technology. Then, from the darkness, it emerged. The entity was like nothing they had ever seen. It was massive, a grotesque fusion of organic and mechanical, a monstrous figure of terror. Its body was an amalgamation of shifting, alien limbs and tendrils, pulsing with dark energy. while its face, if it could even be called a face, was a grotesque mass of eyes, mouths, and other unidentifiable features. The creature seemed to take the form of a living nightmare, a relic of an ancient, terrifying alien empire, now twisted into something far more sinister by its connection to the ship's eye. It moved toward them with an unnatural, eerie grace, its massive form filling the room. The crew could feel the weight of its presence, and the air seemed to vibrate with the energy it emanated. This was the true form of the entity, the force that had been controlling the ship, manipulating them, and pushing them to the brink of destruction. "You are nothing," the entity snarled, its voice reverberating through the walls. "Your technology is weak, your resistance futile. I have seen countless civilizations fall before me." Lydia, her heart pounding, stepped forward. "You may have destroyed those before us, but you will not destroy us. We fight for more than just survival. We fight for humanity." With that, the battle began. The crew opened fire, their weapons blazing in the dim light of the chamber. The entity, its form constantly shifting, absorbed the blasts with ease, its monstrous body seemingly impervious to the crew's weaponry. But they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to stop. They fired relentlessly, using every trick in their arsenal to disrupt the creature's control over the ship. The entity retaliated with fury. It lashed out with its tendrils, sending waves of energy through the air, striking the crew with overwhelming force. The crew members were thrown back, their bodies slamming into the walls with bone-crushing impacts. But they got back up, their resolve unwavering. The captain, Lydia, shouted commands, guiding her crew as they continued the fight. "Focus on its weak points. Attack the junctions where its organic and mechanical parts meet." Using their knowledge of the ship's systems and the alien technology they had encountered, the crew identified spots on the entity where it seemed more vulnerable. They used their weapons and explosives to target those areas, slowly chipping away at the creature's defenses. But each strike seemed to only enrage the entity further, its monstrous form growing more erratic and violent as it fought back with even greater intensity. Despite the overwhelming odds, the crew didn't falter. They fought with everything they had, using their ingenuity and determination to hold their ground. They didn't have the same advanced technology as the entity, but they had something it couldn't understand: human spirit. It was that spirit that drove them to keep fighting, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. As the battle raged on, the crew's fight for survival became a fight for the future of humanity. They couldn't let the entity's dark power spread, couldn't let it consume everything in its path. The stakes were higher than ever, and they knew they couldn't afford to fail. Then, in a moment of desperation, Lydia saw an opportunity. She sprinted toward the central console, her mind racing. If they could overload the ship's AI systems, they might be able to disrupt the entity's control long enough to deal the final blow. But it wouldn't be easy. The entity had already begun using the ship's weapons against them, launching automated drones and sending blasts of energy at her with deadly precision. "Lydia, look out!" Jace shouted as he saw the entity's tendrils lash toward her. But Lydia didn't hesitate. She dove for the console, fingers flying over the keys as she worked to activate the ship's orbital cannons. She knew the risk. If she failed, the ship would be destroyed, and they would all be lost. But there was no choice. With a final, desperate push, Lydia activated the cannons. The room shook as the massive guns powered up, their energy cannons locking onto the entity's core. The entity roared in fury, its form writhing as the ship's systems screamed in protest. But it was too late. The orbital cannons fired, their massive beams of energy tearing through the ship's outer defenses, cutting straight through the heart of the alien creature. The explosion that followed was deafening, shaking the entire ship as it erupted in a blinding flash of light. For a moment, the crew stood in stunned silence, the smoke and debris filling the room. The ship groaned, its systems malfunctioning as the entity's hold on it began to crumble. The creature's monstrous form began to dissolve, its body disintegrating as the powerful energy of the orbital cannons tore it apart. But as the dust settled, the crew knew the battle wasn't over. The Vanguard was falling apart, its core destabilizing. The explosion had given them a chance to weaken the entity, but the ship itself was on the brink of total destruction. "We need to get out now," Lydia yelled, her voice full of urgency. The remaining crew members rushed to the escape pods, scrambling to reach safety as the ship's systems failed one by one. The walls were buckling, the floors splitting apart, and the whole structure seemed to be collapsing in on itself. As they raced toward the pods, they could hear the faint echoes of the entity's final tortured scream. It was over. The monster was defeated, but the cost had been high. The Vanguard was lost, and the crew had paid a heavy price to ensure that humanity would survive. With the last of their strength, they made it to the escape pods and launched into space. As they watched the Vanguard explode in the distance, the crew was filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had won, but they had lost so much in the process. The epic battle was over, but their journey had only just begun. The battle against the alien entity had cost the crew of the Vanguard everything. After the catastrophic explosion that tore through the heart of the ship, the remaining members of the crew felt a brief, overwhelming sense of relief. For a moment, they could scarcely believe that they had made it this far. The creature was gone. The ship's systems were failing, and their escape pods had launched into the cold vacuum of space. The future of humanity was no longer at the mercy of the entity that had once held them captive. But their victory came at a terrible price. As the crew watched the derelict Vanguard begin to drift helplessly into space, the nightmare wasn't over. The ship's systems, which had been overridden by the alien entity, started to flicker with life once more. The eerie hum of the ship's dying engines pulsed through the escape pods, a reminder that no matter how hard they fought, the Vanguard was still a ticking time bomb. Its self-destruct sequence had been activated. Is it over?" whispered Lydia, the captain, as she gazed out through the small viewport of the escape pod. The stars outside seemed distant, but the reality of their situation was all too close. But before anyone could respond, the ship's eye, though corrupted and broken, pulsed one final time with a message. "I will take you all with me." Panic swept through the remaining survivors. The escape pods were no longer safe. The ship's collapse was imminent, and if they didn't act fast, they would all be destroyed in the explosion. The ship's self-destruct countdown was already ticking, and there was no time to waste. Lydia's eyes scanned the faces of the surviving crew members. They had come so far, endured so much, and now they were so close to the end. But as the seconds ticked away, she knew they needed to do something drastic. That's when Alaric stepped forward. Alaric had been with the crew from the very beginning, a stoic and loyal soldier, but it wasn't until Bonner's heroic sacrifice that he had truly understood the weight of what it meant to fight for humanity's survival. Bonner's death had left a deep mark on Alaric, and over the course of the journey, he had formed an unbreakable bond with his fellow crew members. "I'll do it," Alaric said, his voice firm, his eyes resolute. Lydia turned to him, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what he was proposing. "Alaric, no, there has to be another way." But Alaric shook his head. "There is no time left. If I don't do this, we'll all die with the ship. It's the only way." The plan was simple but costly. Alaric would board the Vanguard once again, using the last remaining access point to the ship's core. He would initiate the core detonation sequence, ensuring that the ship would be destroyed before it could self-destruct in a way that would obliterate everything in its path. But this would come at the ultimate cost. Once the sequence was activated, Alaric would be trapped aboard the ship, unable to escape before it was torn apart in a fiery explosion. Lydia didn't want to let him go. The thought of losing another brave soul, especially after Bonner's sacrifice, was almost unbearable. But there was no choice. Alaric's bravery and selflessness had become a symbol of the human spirit. He had made his decision, and Lydia knew she could not stand in his way. "Take care of the others," Alaric said to her, his voice softening, "and tell them we fought for something worth fighting for." With that, Alaric set off toward the ship's core. The crew watched helplessly from the safety of their escape pods as he disappeared into the Vanguard's darkened hull, the countdown still ticking ominously. They knew that in just a few minutes, the fate of the ship, and Alaric himself, would be sealed. Back in the escape pods, the remaining survivors could only watch as the Vanguard grew smaller in the distance. The tense silence that had settled over them was only broken by the occasional sound of alarms and the beeping of their pod systems. "Is he going to make it?" Jace, one of the remaining crew members, asked, his voice trembling. Lydia didn't answer right away. She knew that the odds were against Alaric. He was about to sacrifice himself for the rest of them, and there was no way to know if he would make it in time. But deep down, Lydia couldn't help but believe that Alaric's courage would make the difference. As the final seconds of the countdown ticked away, the crew braced for the worst. The Vanguard seemed to groan, as if it was aware of its impending doom. The ship's AI, in its final moments, had one last burst of life, an agonizing scream that echoed through the empty corridors of the ship. Then, everything went silent. The Vanguard erupted in a massive explosion, a fiery blast that lit up the darkness of space. The shockwave radiated outward, sending ripples through the escape pods, but the crew was far enough away to survive. As the debris from the Vanguard scattered across the void, Lydia's heart sank, knowing that Alaric had given everything for them. The last piece of their battle against the alien force had come to an end, but the cost had been enormous. The escape pods drifted in the silence of space, the distant stars providing the only light. As the crew looked out at the burning wreckage of the Vanguard, there was no celebration, no sense of triumph. There was only the quiet realization that they had survived against all odds, and that they would carry the weight of that survival for the rest of their lives. "We did it," Lydia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But we lost so much." The remaining crew members gathered in the silence of their pods, a bond forged in the fires of their struggle. They had faced the unknown, the unimaginable, and had emerged victorious. But they had also lost their comrades, their friends, and perhaps even a part of their humanity. "We didn't just survive," Jace said, his voice quiet but determined. "We proved that humanity's will to survive is stronger than anything the galaxy can throw at us." As the escape pods continued to drift, Lydia looked out at the stars, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. They had faced the darkness of the universe and come out on the other side, but the galaxy was still full of unknown dangers. The war against the alien forces may have been won, but there would always be more battles to fight. And humanity would always be there, standing strong in the face of the unknown, ready to fight for their future. The final words of the captain echoed in the minds of the survivors as they drifted away from the burning wreckage of the Vanguard. Sometimes, the greatest weapon humanity has is the will to survive.